Couldn't you just listen to that all day? These are the videos I normally have up at the beginning of class, so students can have some time to appreciate the complexities of the Antikythera Mechanism, and to give students a moment to appreciate how beautiful a theremin can sound when played by Clara Rockmore. I want to warn you before we start that this is just meant as an overview. I'm going to look at stops along the way in this narrative, and to anyone who already knows about computing history, they may seem random, and they will seem incomplete, but I'm choosing particular technologies or objects that I think have something to offer design students beyond just that technology or the moment in computing history that it represents. This will be a two-part investigation. The first part looks at computers as new technology, as objects that required design, and introduced new sorts of thinking about interface and system design. So chapter 1 is the designing of computers, of electronics. And then part 2 will look at how computers are used as design tools, allowing forms that were unprecedented and honestly unimaginable before, and what that has meant for the path of industrial design. So chapter 2 is designing with computers. If you remember last week's conversation about plastics, keep it in mind, because most of the objects we're going to look at could not exist in another material. The development of electronics and the development of plastics go hand in hand. The first thing I want to do is ask you to consider what is computing. It's using devices to help calculate and tabulate information that's too complex to hold in our own brains. And that's not new. We've been doing it the whole time we've been around. The Antikythera Mechanism is an interesting example. It's an ancient Greek object from the 1st century BC, and it's essentially an analog computer, which explains astronomical movement. It was found in 1900 in a shipwreck, so it was made, it sank, and it stayed there until 1900. And it really wasn't fully understood until very recently. You can see why. The picture in the middle is what it looks like today. Clearly, it has some gears and mechanisms involved, but it took a lot of science to finally figure out what's inside this block that has fused together over time underwater, with different methods of analyzing and determining what's inside. Then scientists around the world threw their collective brain power at figuring out what it was meant to do. And now there are some beautiful recreations of it to help us understand it. Think about what this device would allow in a world that didn't yet understand planetary movement. If you could predict an eclipse, you would seem like a pretty powerful person. Another great example of an historical object that I would count as a computer is the Jacquard Loom. This is used to transfer complicated patterns drawn on paper to a series of punch cards, which then control the movement of the heddles on a loom, transferring that complicated pattern into a woven cloth. And before this technology, each warp thread would have to be lifted by hand, and the weaver would have to keep track of how that pattern was being created. The Jacquard Loom is named after Joseph Marie Jacquard, who first demonstrated this technology in 1801, although as with all other innovations we looked at all semester, it was based on existing ideas that he realized better than anyone else had and crossed the finish line with that. And as a result, textiles could become exponentially more complicated while also being faster to weave. This technology was a big step forward in terms of how to use punch cards to control movement, but also in how to interpret a pattern into those punch cards. The process of producing the punch cards was almost as important. A lot of the history of computing is tied up with the history of producing calculations. The desire to do more math than we can do comfortably in our heads has pursued us for a long time and fueled the investigation of better methods of doing calculations using mechanisms. This is one of the most elegant and beautiful examples of that pursuit. The Curta Calculator was designed by and is named after Kurt Herstark. His father owned a mechanical calculator manufacturing company, so he grew up understanding how mechanisms could be used to keep track of numbers. This calculator is remarkable for many reasons, but chief among them for me is that it was conceived in 1937 while Herstark was imprisoned at Buchenwald concentration camp. He was what they called an intelligent slave, allowed to live, but only if he used his mental abilities to help with the war effort for the Nazis. Somehow, while at Buchenwald, he was able to imagine this calculator, perfect it in his brain, keep track of the ideas, and then after the war, begin realizing this design. It was introduced in Vienna in 1948, and it remained the best method of calculating computations until the 1970s, when electronic calculators came along. And in the beautiful animation of the digital model at the top, you can see some of the details that make this work. One of the things you should know about the Curta Calculator is that it works with haptic feedback. So the knurled surfaces around the edge tell you where to hold it and where to turn the crank. Turning the crank in a clockwise motion adds, in a counterclockwise motion subtracts. But then you can lift the top ring and turn it so that you can perform addition or subtraction in orders, by tens or by hundreds instead of one at a time. So you can do much larger sums. And in spite of the fact that the gearings and mechanisms inside are remarkably complicated, the operation of this is relatively simple. And that idea of haptic feedback not only allows you to use the Curta Calculator without really having to watch it the whole time, but it also provides beautiful evidence of how the design of an object can help it work better. And I think we've forgotten that with most electronics. We've let electronics off the hook for giving us haptic feedback anymore. We have keyboards that don't make a sound when you've pressed the button. We have keyboards that are flat that you don't know your fingers are on. And I think looking at the Curta Calculator and what makes this interface work has a lot to offer in terms of going back to a type of design for interface and electronics that's more meaningful if you're a human being trying to use them. Remember that computers, for a very long time, came from this mechanical world. The Harvard Mark I computer is a great example of this. It was built as a partnership between Harvard and IBM in 1944, and there's some conversation that Norman Bell Geddes' office was called in to design the case and the interface, but I haven't found any meaningful language that clarifies what that involved. The Harvard Mark I was the first programmable digital computer made in the United States. And this was not an electronic computer, it was a mechanical one. It was constructed out of switches and relays and rotating shafts and clutches. It weighed 5 tons. It used 500 miles of wire. As you can see in the picture, it was 8 feet tall and about 51 feet long. The whole thing was powered by a 5 horsepower electric motor. And it ran and the Harvard Mark I ran nonstop for 15 years. Good luck to my computer today trying to top that record. People who heard it compared the clicking of the gears to a room full of people knitting. On the right, you can see the paper tape reader and a strip of the paper program tape. You'd run that through to load the program into the computer. You can see the really direct connection to a Jacquard Loom in the way this mechanism operates. Also, imagine how much this cost. In the early days of mechanical computing, it was really only governments and huge corporations and maybe some educational institutions that could even think about taking on the task of developing this technology. The first successful commercial computer was manufactured by IBM, the IBM 702, in 1954, and it read data from punch cards and magnetic tape input. By the end of the 1950s, there were more than 1,500 IBM 702s installed, making it at the time the most widely used computer in the world. I'm showing you later versions because the sad truth is that computers didn't change all that much. Between 1956 and 1964, there were some upgrades in memory storage, magnetic reel-to-reel tape data storage helped out, but still, they're relatively the same. And just as an FYI, in case anybody doesn't know what a punch card is, as with the Jacquard Loom, it's a series of cards with holes punched in it that instruct mechanical operation of a device. These are some pictures of the IBM punch cards, and they're really beautiful. Last year, I don't know why, I guess it's just the kind of person I'm turning into, I decided to understand a punch card by drawing it in my sketchbook, and I fell in love with the complexity of the numbering system and the divisions. So if this is your jam, as the kids say, check them out more. A series of these contained a program, and a whole stack of them would be put in the card reader and run through into the computer to tell it what to do. But as long as computers used tapes and tubes and acres of wires, they were not going to be able to change all that much or migrate into everyday life. Computers weren't going to change a whole lot of people's lives because we didn't have access to them. So what I'm working towards is an understanding of when that changed. These computers used vacuum tubes, just like the early radios that we looked at. When those vacuum tubes gave way to transistors in the 1950s, everything could change. In the same way that the transistor radios that we looked at last week were so different from their vacuum tube predecessors. Another thing that would have to change before computers became useful to the populace was the cost. In 1960, a typical computer sold for $2.9 million. That's $26 million today. Or if you couldn't afford to buy it, you could rent it from IBM for $63,000 a month. That's $500,000 a month today. So that's one reason IBM became one of the biggest corporations in the world, and it's another reason that computers stayed with large corporations and governments. For that money, you got 32K. That's 32,000 bytes. I paused for a moment to let the student who just sent me an email yesterday with a link to a file that was 32 gigabytes wonder what a K is. That 32K machine weighed 32,000 pounds, or 16 tons. So there's lots of room to improve this, right? This is the boot sequence for the IBM 1800. Now you open your computer and it's on. 5 years ago, you opened your computer and you had to turn it on and wait for it to boot up. It is unimaginable to us today that we would have to instruct the computer how to wake up, how to turn on, before you're even doing any computing. So this is the sequence of switches and buttons and knobs that had to be executed exactly correctly to get the computer on. And when this guy figures it out with his beautiful polyester floral shirt, he'll give you the thumbs up because he's got the computer on for the day. The IBM 1800 system was mostly used in industrial plants, powering machinery. In fact, in June of 2010, the last 4 operating IBM 1800s were put out of service, and they were being used at the Pickering Nuclear Generating Station in Pickering, Ontario, Canada, till 2010, 50 years of service. What's even better than the incredible service those computers provided is that when they were replaced by new equipment that was built specifically to emulate the operating system of the IBM 1800, because it was so durable and so reliable that changing it actually was more risky than maintaining it. So the first transition was from vacuum tubes to transistors in the 1950s. But the second transition, which actually is what will allow personal computing, is when transistors gave way to circuit boards, allowing a huge increase in processing speed and memory, and also a reduction in size. 1976 saw the birth of the commercially available home computer. Microprocessors arrived and hit the main stage in the mid-70s, and electronics took such a huge step forward that they became almost unrecognizably different than their predecessors. This is the Apple I. On the lower left, you can see the main component, the circuit board, the motherboard for that computer. And on the right, you can see all the different ways that people invented to house this computer. Because it was sold as a kit, you got the components and you had to put it together yourself. Some people built a wooden box, some people just shoved it in a briefcase. I love the picture in the center on the top because the cassette tape player is right in there. That's how you would load the program into the computer. No more punch cards, no more punch tape. Now you have magnetic cassette tape to load the program in, but you needed a player integrated into the computer to make that work. The kit sold for $600. That's about $2,600 today. And so this was not for everybody. Not just anybody would want to put this thing together and figure out how to use it. This was really still for computing fanatics and technology enthusiasts. This computer came with 32K of onboard RAM. That's the same amount of memory as the computer we were just looking at that cost $3 million. So $3 million for 32K came down to $600 in just 16 years. Also, that computer weighed 16 tons, and this one is light enough to shove in a briefcase and carry around. The Apple II saw that technology housed in a way that really made it possible to imagine integrating it into daily life. The first plastic computer housings were made of what we call structural foam plastic. It's injection molded plastic, but at the last moment before the plastic goes in the mold, a gas is injected, creating bubbles. So the plastic skins over on the surface where it hits the mold, but it stays with a cellular structure inside. One of the problems with that is that in skinning over, it gets a swirly pattern, and it's quite unattractive. So the solution was to paint all of these computers with a beige textured paint that hid all of the mold defects and gave it a sort of uniform surface, but also a pretty ugly tan surface that all computers had. Nevertheless, this object now needs someone to care about what it looks like. It has an outside housing. It's imagined to live in your house somewhere, maybe your office. In this case, maybe your kitchen. I think that's optimistic. So we're starting to get people considering what these devices are going to look like. Steve Jobs specifically created a form for the Apple II that referenced typewriters. And he wrote about this. He said products should be based on familiar patterns. The Apple II in 1977 used a printed circuit motherboard, read programs in through cassette tape interface, and came with a game called Breakout. Do you understand the importance of that? It came with a game, this incredible, scintillating, energizing, exciting computer game. When you hook the computer up to a colored television, you could have computer graphics. That's what you're seeing in the ad in the middle. And this computer sold for just under $1,300. That's just over $4,000 today. So it's still expensive, but way more affordable. A person could imagine owning this. And then on the right, we see the Apple III, which came out in 1980. It was more for business use, and it cost almost $8,000, so it was much more expensive. Primary source documents are so interesting to look at. Apple is sending some subtle messages about who the user might be. In the background, we see an Egmont Aaron's 1937 KitchenAid. And to me, that says this new device, this Apple II, will become an iconic piece of design history, a tool you use for decades. And in the front, you can see he's holding a Vignelli-designed Max II plastic mug that we looked at last week, which was so of its time in 1977. There's lots to notice in the subtle messaging of primary source documents, including the polyester turtleneck situation. Lots of companies almost instantly followed suit. The Commodore PET came out in 1977, and PET stands for Personal Electronic Transactor. Clearly, they thought of PET first and then figured out what it could stand for after. It came fully assembled, relatively straightforward to operate, 4 or 8K of memory, and it came with built-in cassette drive right there as part of the piece of equipment. It sold for just under $800, which is about $3,000 today. So less than the cost of an Apple, and it came complete with monitor. And the Atari 400 came out in 1979. It cost $550. And it had 8K base, but you could get it up to 48K, and we didn't know what we could ever need that much memory for. And I'm skipping ahead because the computer we need to spend more time looking at is the one that actually started to consider broadening the user base for computers. This was not a computer designed for my dad, the computer programmer. This was a computer designed for anyone and helps get us into today's computing world in a really interesting, big, bold way. And notice that I've labeled these images with the name of the design firm that helped produce it. That alone is a pretty bold realization, that these objects needed to be designed, not merely created or assembled. In 1982, Hartmut Esslinger renamed his consultancy Frog Design, which is Federal Republic of Germany, Frog, and opened an office in California right across the street from Apple so that he could work with Apple on the development of all of their computers. He realized he needed to open a branch wherever current design activity was most active. So his office in Germany opened a branch in California, and then in 1984, another office in Tokyo because of all of the progress in electronics and technology that was happening there. And that allowed him to make this crazy boast about what his company could offer you. Their locations offered Frog Design the benefit of bringing Asian teamwork, European discipline, German precision, American optimism, and California craziness together. The Mac SE sold for $2,900. That's just under $7,000 today. So it's still really expensive, but it is something somebody could imagine buying, if not for their home, certainly for their business. And the other thing that distinguished this computer from the Apple II is that it came with a 20 megabyte hard drive, and you could increase that to a 40 megabyte hard drive if you wanted. Megabyte. It just seemed inconceivable that something could have that much memory. Also, a lot of us were skeptical of this thing called a hard drive. It's inside, we can't get it out, what if it breaks? So you could also get your computer with 2 floppy drives instead if you wanted to store everything you owned on little removable floppy disks. There are a lot of really beautiful documents recording the design process for this computer. We know what this computer looked like. It was so successful and so omnipresent in our world that it's almost impossible to imagine there were other versions entertained. And looking at all of the sketches help you understand how hard it is to arrive at something that seems inevitable. Also, Hartmut Esslinger was trying to do something relatively new with computer design, which was do more than merely house the internal components. Esslinger wrote, "Aesthetics evoke emotions, but are just one of the elements of a great product. Design must connect technology and nature with us humans." I'm going to let this ad play now, and if you can see your way past the inexplicable steel drum soundtrack, it will explain some of the things you need to remember about this computer.
Introducing Mackintosh. It does all the things you'd expect a business computer to do. It does a lot of things you wouldn't expect a business computer to do. and it does some things no other business computer has ever done before. Of course, to do all this, you will have to learn to do this. Mackintosh from Apple.
So the big idea in this ad is any of us could learn how to use this. And that may seem very obvious to people who were not alive before the advent of graphical interfaces. But before this, you had to learn programming code. You had to be able to learn the language of computing to be able to use a computer. And suddenly in 1984, there was an interface in between the computer's brain and our brains that allowed us to communicate without speaking the same language. And that was a really big change. These are some pictures of alternate explorations for what the computer might have looked like. And Hartmut Esslinger wrote, "Computers are an industrial, mass-produced form of artificial intelligence. As I explored ideas for designing the face of this new product paradigm, I looked at history, in particular Native American mythology, because I thought that Apple's design should be rooted in the West Coast's past. I discovered the geometric sand paintings of the Navajo, and then the art of the Aztecs, whose anthropomorphic reliefs often resemble astronauts. Those images inspired us to design Apple's computers to look like little people and to transform the display screen into a face." Say what you will about that colorful language, and believe it or don't believe it, but this is a really big new way to talk about approaching form that design in computers required. Merely housing the internal components was no longer going to work in creating an outside that made any kind of sense. So Esslinger realized that he would have to infuse this design project with some other information. FYI, there was a lot of amazing future casting, blue sky thinking, that came out of this project. If you're interested, Esslinger published a book a few years ago called Keep It Simple, and it's a really thorough overview of the entire project with a lot of amazing images of process, including these models for items that didn't get built but were imagined in 1983. A flip phone, a wrist and headphone that communicate with each other, a tablet you can write on, a tablet that docks into a station so you can have computing on the go in multiple ways. These have all been realized since, and I think it's pretty humbling to discover that the ideas are as old as they are. These are fully realized models made out of foam and wood and paint and a lot of craftsmanship. That graphical user interface, the GUI interface, is a really important part of how computers changed so that the rest of us could use them. The first GUI interface was introduced by Xerox in 1973. It was the Xerox Alto. This computer cost $12,000 just to make. That's $66,000 today. And it was sold for $40,000. That's over $200,000 in today's dollars. You can imagine there was not huge demand for that. About 2,000 were made. Still, it was the first computer to rethink the interface. The two Steves, Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, saw the Xerox PARC, which is the Palo Alto Research Center's bitmap user interface, at a demonstration in 1979, and they decided they would license the concept to include in their Apple computers. The computer on the right I'm just showing you because it existed and I think it's worth knowing. Xerox did make their own complete computer sets that sold amazingly for $75,000. That's over $200,000 today. So you don't hear a lot about the 8010 Star Dandelion as a result. You do hear a lot about what Apple Computer did with that interface because they did a better job attaching that interface to affordable equipment that was designed for users. The interface was such a big deal. You could have pictures, you could have graphics, you could have fonts, you could draw. So on the left is what computer screens looked like before. IE's green, type only, no pictures. The entire interface was a linguistic one. You had to learn the language of the computer and type it in. Suddenly, we get pictures and we can interact with them by pointing and clicking. And that brings me to one of my favorite moments in the entire semester of teaching History of Industrial Design, which is getting to talk about Susan Kare and her incredible genius at representing huge concepts with a mere handful of pixels. Susan Kare was the screen graphics and digital font designer for the original Mac. And the first generation icons she designed for this interface are mostly still with us today. If you look at the tools in the Apple Paint program, you'll recognize some friends: the lasso tool, the hand, the paint bucket. the paintbrush, the pencil. Those are all still the same today, and many of the system icons have stayed the same as well. Susan Kare recently gave her archive from this project to the Museum of Modern Art in New York, so we can see her actual work process with pen and pencil on graph paper. She wasn't interested in doing these designs on a computer. She did them manually, which she described by writing, "I loved the puzzle-like nature of working in 16 by 16 and 32 by 32 pixel icon grids, and the marriage of craft and metaphor. Bitmap graphics are like mosaics and needlepoint and other pseudo-digital art forms, all of which I had practiced before going to Apple." Kare's ability to represent a complicated action or decision or thought with an image is really sophisticated. Some of them she invented from scratch, some of them reference existing visual language. She said that the command icon is based on a Swedish campground sign that indicates an interesting feature. In addition to all of the icons, Kare designed the original Mac fonts, Geneva, Chicago, and Cairo, which opened the door to the dingbats that she also designed, and I might even suggest that those dingbats open the door to our current obsession with communicating with small pictures and emojis. Jonathan Ive joined Apple in 1992, and he brought a new level of care to thinking about the outside of computers than any computer designer had before him. The iMac G3 changed the whole landscape of what computers could be. It was introduced in 1998. It cost $1,299. That's about $2,500 today. And it had some really useful features like a 4 gigabyte hard drive. Gigabyte. Again, we had no idea how we could ever find a use for 4 gigabytes. It had built-in speakers, a built-in CD drive, a built-in infrared so you could communicate with other computers and devices. It came complete with the mouse and the keyboard, and most importantly, it had a built-in modem. Up until this point, a modem was something you had to attach separately and then plug your phone line into. So think about what these features mean. The memory is nice, that makes it useful, it probably makes it last longer. But the speakers, the CD drive, the ability to communicate with other devices, that's admitting that this is probably going to be used for entertainment, for personal reasons, in addition to business or school. And that modem signaled the realization that the internet was the new computer landscape. No longer something you could use your computer for, but something you would use your computer for. Also notice the color and the translucent plastic, no more painted structural foam. This is a tinted translucent polycarbonate. Although no computer had ever looked like this before, pretty quickly every other computer was trying to integrate not only some of the features, but a lot of the aesthetics of the iMac. I very quickly mastered with Apple how to interpret computing as sculpture, combining software interface with hardware requirements and giving form to technology. Sometimes that was just an elegant cube with a translucent layer over a solid white layer. Sometimes it was an expressive form in smooth plastic. But in the case of the iMac G4, my favorite computer ever, it actually took the form of a really masterful creation of marriage of form and technology. I'm showing the ad in the lower left, which I think brings some of the features of this computer to life in an amusing way. I managed to keep my iMac G4 in use for almost 15 years because the flexibility that it offered, not only in its movement, you could use it standing or seated, but also the flexibility of expansion and connectivity. This kind of maturity of features, functions, and form took designers a really long time to get right, and it has not always been this masterfully handled. I started by showing you the Antikythera Mechanism and a Jacquard Loom and the Curta Calculator, and although there is design involved in all of those, they are more created and engineered and manufactured than they are designed. But the exercise of giving form to technology is not a new one either. And I showed you those objects as evidence of computing technology existing a long time ago. There's also some nice evidence of thinking about the form technology should take long before Apple arrived. The video at the beginning helped you hear what a theremin sounded like. Now I want to talk about how it worked and what it looked like. Leon Theremin invented his theremin in the late 1920s, and it went into production by RCA in 1929. It's the only musical instrument you play without touching. The wand on the right controls the pitch. The closer your hand is, the higher the pitch. The farther away, the lower the pitch. And the left hand controls the volume. The farther away from the loop, the louder. The closer in, the quieter. It's very, very difficult to play this device. You have to have pretty refined motor skills. This is an electric device. Your body affects the volume and the tone because your body is completing the electric circuit that allows the sound to be produced. And if you open up the back of one of these, you see vacuum tubes and coils and all sorts of other things that I don't even understand. Imagine the challenge of trying to figure out what this should look like on the outside. It's an instrument that works in a way that no other instrument has ever worked, and so it can't copy the form of any other instrument. When we looked at the early radios of the Art Deco period, we saw that they were mimicking existing furniture, a desk or a Victrola cabinet. With something like the theremin, there is no predecessor. So what the form is looking at instead is the next closest neighbor. It's a hybrid of a radio cabinet and a music stand. Visually, you would understand that it does something with sound, although you would never be able to predict exactly what. Isamu Noguchi's radio nurse is a famous object in museum collections and deserves to be, because it is probably the earliest and certainly the most complete and compelling combination of technology and form. The project began as a commission for the president of Zenith Radio, who wanted to monitor his daughter while on board his yacht. Rough life, huh? And it turned into a product that Zenith could manufacture and sell. There was an interest in the late 1930s in protecting babies. And this is one of those examples I promised on the first day of class, where just weird stuff that happens in the world affects design and affects progress. Charles Lindbergh became famous for flying solo across the Atlantic, but he returned to the news in 1932 when his 2-year-old son was kidnapped. And the gruesome outcome of that inspired not only legislation with the Federal Kidnapping Act, but also a whole slew of baby protection devices. And interestingly, Leon Theremin, who invented the theremin, also worked on electronic alarms using his understanding of proximity and electronics to create proximity sensors for burglar alarms. In this case, Noguchi's radio nurse is essentially an intercom, a baby monitor. The picture on the upper right shows what lives in the baby's room, and you can also see it very small in the picture of the crying baby in the crib in the Zenith ad. That doesn't need to have a nice form, right? Because that's a piece of equipment. That is a functioning part of the baby factory. And we want it to look like a machine. But its representative in the living room or the dining room, or where the parents are entertaining, ought to look like a piece of decor. And these two advertising images are full of signals that help you appreciate that. The radio nurse is on a bookshelf right above a carved, I don't know, antelope or something. And Noguchi was the perfect person to take on this commission because he had spent decades doing portrait busts, and he understood exactly how to create a sculpture that had authority and presence. And as with Hartmut Esslinger, looking at other sources for form inspiration, Noguchi did not invent this whole cloth. He made very specific and careful references to existing forms. The radio nurse is a hybrid of a nurse's snood cap, a hair covering, and a Japanese kendo mask. And those are beautiful, intentional references that say, I may be an attractive shelf sculpture, but I'm also taking care of and protecting your child. Electricity is a really important part of the story of how mechanical computing gave way to electronic computing. Electricity was also transforming a lot of other objects in the 1930s. Electricity had been around for a long time by the 1930s, but really it was only just becoming a part of everyday living in everyone's homes. Much of rural America was not electrified until the WPA projects of the 1930s and 40s. Think about how things need to and can be reimagined with electricity. You could take the regular existing form and the regular existing materials and just electrify them. Then you could use regular forms but with new materials like Bakelite. And then you could approach making completely new forms with new everything. As one example of that trajectory, here are some musical instruments. The Hawaiian guitar arrived in 1931, sold by the Rhode Corporation, which is such a ridiculous name. It stands for Electro-Patented Instrument Corporation, Rhode. And it was essentially an electrified banjo. But it opened the door to later versions of the electric guitar when they could be reimagined in new materials. Without the need for a resonating chamber, a guitar could become a flat slab of Bakelite and chrome-plated metal, like the Rickenbacker International Electro-Spanish guitar. And then if you look at the electro string instrument, Bakelite electric violin, everything starts to change. You get a completely new idea about an instrument. Just as a side note, all of these companies are the same people who just kept changing their company names. Also remember, these devices were electric, but they needed a speaker. They needed amplification, which was a separate device using huge vacuum tubes. When vacuum tubes could be replaced with transistors, technology started to be more normal. It started to appear in more places. It became smaller and more affordable. But this process wasn't always smooth. On the left, you can see an ad for the National Calculator Company from 1952 to give you a sense of how extreme a mechanical calculator could actually be in office use. In 1967, Texas Instrument made the first handheld electronic calculator, and then other companies followed relatively quickly. The Pocketronics were $150 to $400. That's $1,000 to $2,500 today, and they only had 4 math functions. Also, there was no such thing as an LED readout, so they had thermal printouts. You needed a spool of paper, and your calculations were printed on a little strip, and they weighed over a pound. This is progress. It's definitely miniaturizing calculations. It's putting more calculating power in your hand or maybe your pocket, and that's a huge step forward in terms of technology. But that's not really going to help get electronics into daily lives. The progress of electronics was most regularly introduced into our daily lives, not through calculators, but through toys. Technological progress could be commercialized and monetized much more quickly by the toy industry. These early electronic toys did not have a high level of form integrity. There were not designers caring about the niceties of the radius or the fillets or the transitions from one form to another. Nevertheless, the Merlin, probably the best toy I ever owned, was so popular that they sold 2.5 million in the first 2 years it was available. It had 6 different games that all used blinking lights and sounds to enthrall children and drive everyone around them completely insane. Sometimes technology is actually thrown at toys first, and then it works its way backwards into the more important fields after that. A good example would be the Texas Instruments Speak and Spell from 1978. It was used by thousands of children, and it included a chip that produced the first electronic duplication of the human vocal tract. It could store more than 100 seconds of linguistic sounds, and that ended up being useful in computers later at breaking them free from written linguistics. But its first meaningful presence was in an educational toy. I'll let this ad play so you can hear it.
Spell says S-A-Y-S. That is correct.
You said Speak and Spell could help me spell better.
I wouldn't be doing my job correctly or well if I didn't pause to let you know that the Speak and Spell voice processor was used to produce the vocals on Kraftwerk's 1981 Computer World album. Here's what that sounded like. That generic computer voice has become so iconic that it has been used on countless electronic dance tracks since. Also, E.T. used a modified Speak and Spell to phone home in 1982. As electronics were entering product design, there were some new considerations for designers to take on. How do you locate and indicate and explain an on-off button? How do you provide sensory feedback, haptic information? How much should people know about what's going on the insides? Should there be a skin over the whole thing? Should there be expressed parts? If you're Mario Bellini, you have answers to all of these questions. His Divissima 18 from 1973 is a really early exploration of all of those questions. He realized that turning the device on and off needs more active motor skill. You need feedback. It has to click. So the on-off button, you put your thumb on and you really push up or down and it clicks on or off, so you know you've turned it on. You also get visual confirmation that it's on with the red light. But then the buttons are created with an overskin that's soft. So you get haptic feedback of what's happening inside, but it's a very different, much more intimate feeling. And Bellini did this really intentionally. He was looking at nature for inspiration about feedback levels. And many people have discussed how like nipples these buttons are. That should make you laugh, but also if you think about it, it is an absolutely brilliant parallel. Looking to nature for a model for a button or protrusion that controls wiring and activation. Even the mighty Braun, in trying to switch from mechanical components to electronic ones, had some trouble negotiating the details and the interfaces. The clocks on the left have rotating deck of cards that flip down. There's a central axis through the device, so it clearly suggests that the knob on the outside will rotate for setting the time. The clocks on the right use a circuit board, and circuit boards are tyrants. The designer must locate the features according to where they can be on a circuit board, and the outside form tends to turn into some version of a flat rectangle. There are very few things in our world that want to be a flat rectangle. So how to combine a readout at a convenient angle with a flat rectangle with some place where buttons have to go is a really difficult thing to master. I've never seen the clock on the right in person, but it's described as having a feature where you tip it forward to turn the alarm off, which I think is kind of hilarious because there's almost nothing in the form that explains that we do that. So there's a real struggle in how to unify how the insides work, how the outside will explain that to us, and how we're meant to touch this object and interact with it. I'm not allowed to talk about the development of electronics getting incorporated into our daily lives and how that used product design without looking at the Walkman. Its first predecessor was designed by Nobutoshi Kihara for the chairman of Sony, Okio Morita, who liked to listen to opera and traveled a lot. So he wanted his engineers to build him a device that would allow him to listen to operas while flying. That turned into a device they sold. It's a portable cassette tape player and recorder with headphones, but it was very expensive and left room for improvements. So they continued on and produced the Pressman in 1978, and then eventually the Walkman the next year in 1979. They managed to make it affordable by removing some of the features. It doesn't have a recorder, it doesn't have a speaker, and as a result it was more affordable, although it still cost $170, which is almost $600 today. So it was not inexpensive. I also think it's not especially well designed. If you look at the aesthetics of this and the button location and the thinking about interface, there's not a lot of care. But it was so useful and changed the way we could interact with music in such a radical way that we really didn't care what it looked like. Imagine how lives changed when we had personal music available. We've looked at so many music producing devices this semester. For most of our time on this planet, if you wanted music, you had to learn how to make it or find some people who could do it with you or for you. When we figured out recorded music, people suddenly had access to really good music without having to learn how to do it themselves. But that still required a lot of equipment, lots of records. When we got radio, we had the ability to engage with music and listen to music in an ever-changing sort of rotation without needing to invest in the same amount of equipment. But that's still a public endeavor. If you're going to play the radio, everyone around you has to want to listen to it. And then when we got headphones for stereos, you could listen to music by yourself, but you were tethered to one corner of the room. Suddenly with a Walkman, you could have any music you wanted, anywhere you wanted it. And that was a huge behavioral change for everyone. In fact, it was such a huge behavioral change that Sony found itself having to explain how this device would be useful to the public. They loaded journalists onto a bus that drove around to parks in Tokyo, and they gave the journalists Walkmans to listen to, and they seated the parks with people listening to Walkmans and all doing different, contrary things in their private little musical landscape. The Walkman is a really good example of an object that we didn't understand we needed, and the tremendous success that that existing but unrealized need allowed. Sony predicted it would sell about 5,000 units a month, but they wound up selling 50,000 in the first 2 months alone, and 50 million in the next 10 years. Another thing we should look at is the development of the portable phone. This is the world's first commercial handheld cellular phone. The 1983 Motorola Dynatac 8000X. Dynatac is such a great name. It stands for Dynamic Adaptive Total Area Coverage, which actually is a meaningful acronym because it's relating to the existing Bell Telephone cellular network, which was trying to figure out how mobile devices, phones in cars, could patch into existing land-based wired phone networks. My notes say, look at this piece of crap. It's really important to recognize that electronics threw designers into a total tailspin. This device was figured out by Martin Cooper in a laboratory as a piece of technology. There was no concern with the ease of the interface and how will the user figure out how to use it. That didn't matter. And then the problem was that prototyping just aged into being what the device looked like and how it worked. It never got the luxury of a design phase in between prototyping and launching. But that phone allowed you to talk for 30 minutes on the go. It was 13 inches tall. It took 10 hours to recharge. It stored up to 30 numbers. and it cost just under $4,000. That's $10,000 today. So this is not a phone that everyone was going to be using, but it opened the door to a new future. And we could imagine a time when we were all going to be able to talk wherever we wanted. There's a famous and kind of wonderful story about the launch of this product. At the press launch for this telephone, Martin Cooper went out on the street with journalists and made the first phone call. And the person he called was his rival, Joe Engel, head of the Bell Laboratory research department that was working on Bell Laboratories' portable cellular telephone. So he essentially called up the competition and said, you know that project you've spent so much money and time working on and the teams of people that are currently slaving away to try and cross the finish line? I've already done it. I think the term we use for that today is a bitch slap. Look at the phone on the right. I think it really helps explain not only the need for interface design, but why it started in this era. Bill Moggridge at IDEO identified and then was one of the first people practicing interaction design. And his company, IDEO, helped pioneer user-focused designing because of this situation. And what we start to see as electronics and products get more integrated are new considerations about form. Henry Dreyfuss spent all of his design effort trying to make a phone that was an ergonomic satisfaction, that fit our bodies well. Now we start to see a very different kind of thinking. Maybe the relationship between the inside electronics and the outside casing isn't about ergonomics. Designers started to explore the poetic and the graphic content that was possible in an object, sometimes on top of, but usually instead. And these explorations were sometimes really clumsy, and they were sometimes really elegant, but it was sort of accidental and case by case. It's really easy to say that there was some terrible design work going on, but we were really learning how to balance this new relationship. Maybe a portable radio doesn't need to be a metal box. These two radios are 1 year apart, and yet look how completely different they are. There's a lovely story about the radio on the right. It was produced by Philips, by their division called the Philips Youth Task Force. The division was set up to try and recapture a youth market as Philips had turned into an older company and its customers had aged with it. But when the design department showed this proposal to the executives, they felt it was too radical and there was not going to be a market for it. So the designers made a list of their biggest customers and showed them the design and said, if we made this, would you be willing to commit to buying it? And if so, how many? And they went back to the executives and said, not only is there a market for this, we already have orders for these, so let's produce it. And the radio got produced and was quite successful. With circuit boards, the physicality of products started to disappear, and that led to a reinvention of what many products looked like. There was increasingly little precedent for what an object should look like. So we started to get things like an answering machine that looked more like a Zen garden or a piece of postmodern architecture for your desk than it did any answering machine we knew. Just to explain this technology to anyone who might be unfamiliar with it, there used to be a thing called a telephone, and it used to be attached to the wall. And if you weren't near the wall, you couldn't answer the telephone. So you would miss a phone call. We invented a device that would answer the phone for you and play an outgoing message and record an incoming message. Kind of like messaging still works, but this was using equipment, 2 cassette tapes. So the devices had a lot of physical constraints. It had to have a place where 2 cassette tapes would plug in. It had to have fast forward and rewind and record and lots of buttons and a speaker and a place to plug the phones in. When you switch to a circuit board, you have a couple of buttons and that's it. And where they go is up to you or up to the circuit board. And when Hartmut Esslinger created this answering machine, he tipped that circuit board up on end and housed it in this shape. He made something that was at once serious and sober, but also amusing because it was thumbing its nose at the whole tradition of answering machine. Here's a device called the ViewMaster Interactive Vision, designed by the Ideal Group and produced in 1988. Imagine you have the job of designing a housing for this. It's a circuit board, and that's all this device needs to operate. What are you going to do? This is the only physical component. And this isn't something that will fit in a hand or go next to an ear, so there's no external force deciding what this thing should look like. You as a designer have to make some decisions about form. I think this would challenge any of the designers we looked at this semester, the Eameses with their interest in material limitations, or Henry Dreyfuss with his interest in ergonomics and physical limitations. It would even challenge someone like Raymond Loewy, who might want to apply a streamlined style to this, because you would have to invent that with nothing to apply it to. How do you then create a form that has some kind of meaning? How does the form start to talk about and explain what the thing does if what it is can't be our focus? In the end, this is a pretty beautiful device. It looks like a Noguchi Park design. But what is it? We really struggled to take on this challenge of housing circuit boards. I'll demystify this for you, which won't help. This is a two-way television system that makes you part of the show. The titles that it came with included 4 Sesame Street games, 2 games featuring the Muppet Show characters, and a Disney game featuring Disney's Cartoon Arcade. So what is this thing? It's a super lame, super stupid Sesame Street and Disney interactivity device that plugged into a television. None of what it looks like explains that. It's easy to make fun of this, but how shapes indicate use and tell us how we should interact with a product when the function is layered and internal and might not even include contact with the body is really difficult. Designers began to explain function using the semantics of form. What a form can tell us about what an object is, how it functions, or even just the experience of using it. Sometimes that was really literal. This is a radio. And sometimes it was so abstract that it was merely an arrangement of shapes, rectangles and triangles, with no indication of what the thing did. That thing on the upper right is described as a 4-operator, 8-algorithm, 8-note, polyphonic, and multi-timbral instrument. So I guess it's a music synthesizer of some kind. The Cooper-Hewitt's collection is unusually rich with examples of electronic devices that are a little inscrutable and hard to figure out. I did locate the Kono telephone on the lower left out in the world. The other 2 don't seem to have been produced. I think they're prototypes. It's impossible to know from the Cooper-Hewitt's website, which does not always offer up a lot of information. But I'm showing them to you because even if they weren't made, they really show you what was going on in the design world at the time. There was a really exciting exploration of shapes and meaning. There was an exciting use of plastic to create new forms that couldn't be made in another material. And there was a really exciting desire to use technology and electronics in interesting ways. What there wasn't was a lot of authority or success in creating that combination in a meaningful way. We need to look at product semantics. It's a term I just mentioned, but I want to explain it and explore it more. Semantics is the study of meaning. And by extension, product semantics is the exercise of imbuing an object with meaning to help explain or justify it, or applying richer experiences or visual metaphors to give a product meaning where it might not have its own established meaning. So Hartmut Esslinger looking to the Navajo or looking to Mayan cultures to inspire what a computer could look like. Or Noguchi looking at a Japanese mask or a nurse to give form to a baby protection device. I'm not good when people start talking about phenomenology and hermeneutics and subtilitas intelligendi. My eyes glaze over, I stop listening. But I think that we live in a world that really needs to rethink product semantics. So I'm hoping this conversation can help inspire you to examine the work from this era and learn from it. My students are asked to read Klaus Krippendorf's writing on product semantics for the last week of reading assignments. They tend to run out of enthusiasm before then, but maybe watching this before doing the reading will help rekindle that quest for knowledge. On the left is a smarty pants chart of the concepts of product semantics from Klaus Krippendorf's writing. On the right is product semantics in action. This is another project from Philips, which at the time was really active trying to figure out how to design electronics better. And this was their Beethoven portable stereo. The semantic layer, the storytelling layer, is hilarious. You twiddle the ears to change the volume or tune the radio. You push the cassette tape in by shoving it in where his mouth would be. The readout is where his eyes would be. And then the sound comes out the flowing hair where the speaker is hiding. This didn't get produced, you can understand why, but it's beautiful evidence of design process where the exploration should go as far out as possible and then work backwards towards something a little bit more palatable. Designers explore different approaches to try and instill meaning into objects and help attach new behaviors to new devices. But because so many objects were without precedent, designers kind of went to town and went a little crazy. The most famous example of the early era of product semantics and how it was explored in object design is a prototype created by Lisa Krohn in 1987 called the phone book. It was created with support from Tucker Viemeister. It won the Forma Finlandia competition, and as a result was widely publicized. This device is combining a whole bunch of things we had in our actual physical world. It has a telephone, an answering machine, an address book, and a messaging system. Probably some other features I don't know about. Those are just the ones I know. And it's bridging the paper-based world and the new digital future by very beautifully suggesting that digital interface could have a physical representation. So the way you use this is you turn the page, and each page allows you access to different buttons and activates a different interface. On the phone page, the buttons are allowed to work as numeric input for dialing a phone. On the answering machine page, they control recording and listening to messages. And you can see on the upper left that this device still has 2 little cassette tapes that snap in. The messaging page allows you to print out messages and take them as a piece of paper on the go. That looking forward to new technologies and new behaviors, while also looking backwards to familiar objects like a book, was a really common early approach for what to do with technology. The idea of a semantic layer in product design was not new in the 1980s. It had been part of the education at the Ulm School, but it became a central part of the educational efforts at Cranbrook because Catherine and Michael McCoy, who taught there from 1971 to 1995, were important voices in trying to figure out how to talk about and execute this combination of technology and design. Although most of the published language about product semantics came out of Cranbrook, the inquiry was going on at every design school. These are images of student work created by a professor that most of my students know, who teaches at RISD now, Leslie Fontana, when she was a student at University of the Arts. And any one of these could have been used to illustrate any of the ideas I've been talking about so far. The Watchman on the left is exploring geometric shape and how they could be used as interface or control devices. And the pencil sharpener is looking at creating sculptural form that also helps communicate something about the narrative experience of use. And the message tablet on the right is combining future technology with past surfaces in a way that might help bring existing behaviors into the future. What we started to see in new designs in the late 80s, in the golden era of product semantic investigations, was that form might follow function. But function can be described in many different ways. When you have an electronic object, what it does is up for negotiation. The Elaine printer, which is a design proposal created by Technology Design, looks at creating a narrative out of function. This is a large format stand printer that fuses toner onto the paper with heat. The red part tells the story of how turning the dial in the front will control the darkness where the toner is fused onto the paper in the back. The stand tells the story of how the paper will get printed on and spill down onto the floor. So the form decisions begin to express a functional narrative, an entire story of interaction, instead of one unified idea about what this thing does. Sometimes designs became way more exciting for the level of semantics than for their function. The calculator on the left is a rare example of many things being combined in one successful design. The shape begins with an ergonomic investigation of how it should fit in the hand to put the buttons where they need to be. It has an angled readout, so it's easy to see while you're holding it in your hand. It houses a circuit board that can perform all of the functions, but then it also has a semantic layer that starts to describe the narrative of using this object. The device on the right is an internet radio. And although it's a really engaging sculptural object, but the semantic layer is really confusing. It's supposed to be listening to the internet and playing you music. But I believe that the ears on this are actually the speakers. And you turn it on by poking it in the eye. So it's evocative and interesting, but the narrative is confusing. And then when the semantic layer was just applied like icing, devices became really stupid because that semantic layer and the functional layer were fighting. The Michael Graves telephone is a great example. Michael Graves, the great postmodern designer, cared more about expressing his aesthetic by using combinations of squares and arcs and circles than he cared about how you would interact with these forms to hold them in your hand or dial a phone number. And the Apple laptop on the bottom is one of the rare Apple fails, which merely has shapes to create shapes and colors to create colors, not because it helps this device work in any way, and not because it explains what this device can do. Philippe Starck's entire career is built on a foundation of semantics and product design. And we're going to look a lot more at his work in the second half of this talk. But I want to show you this radio now because it shows really good use of a semantic layer and really bad use all in one object. The top has a series of perforated holes that explain that sound will be coming out. They rise up to create a mound where the visual readout is, and they sink in around the buttons to help you understand how to interact with the device. You press in where it's concave, and you receive information where it's convex. But then on the back, there's this beautiful molded topography. This also looks like some sort of Noguchi playground design. It's a removable plastic wishbone that you snap in, and it works as a stand, so you can stand the radio up. But you all know what the semantic, narrative, storytelling layer of wishbone is. What do you do with a wishbone? I understand that nature produced the form of a wishbone for some functional reason in a bird, but in cultures around our planet, a wishbone is used to determine good luck. Two people hold it and pull, and whoever gets the top part when it breaks apart gets their wish. So why would you use a fortune-telling device that is designed to be broken in half as part of a molded, expensive design radio? The era of product semantics arrived in the 1980s and matured through the 90s, and then went away. And it didn't go away because we got so good at making electronic devices that were confident in their form and helped us understand how to use them. We just kind of gave up. It went away for a few reasons. We started making electronic devices, iPhones, MacBook Pros, that we imagine as temporary. We replace them every couple of years, so we don't have to care what they look like. We started caring more about what they did for us, the apps, the programs, the interfaces, than we did about the objects. Also, Apple started caring more about the legality of what they made. Their ability to patent a rounded corner and then sue everyone else who uses a rounded corner started to matter more. We started to buy computers because they had a rose gold finish, and we started to care about personalizing them with stickers and cases more than valuing how they actually looked native when we got them. I'm hoping that the things I showed you from the early investigation of how electronics could be designed as objects and from the development of the product semantics conversation were exciting and weird and evocative and confusing, and inspire you to care about that again, because there's so much room in the manufactured objects of today to reintroduce some of the richness of the thinking about how form can not only tell us how to use something and then satisfy us when we're using it because it fits us well, but can also be evocative, can also be interesting, can also tell a story. We've kind of given up on using our objects to tell stories, to be inspiring, and I think that's a shame. So get to it. Take a break, practice your jump roping, eat some ice cream, soak some more beans for next week, and come back for part 2, which will be looking at how design changed because we could use computers as design tools. Say those numbers again with more emphasis. How come I yawn? Like, it doesn't matter what time of day I do this, I yawn. I never yawn in class. Do I yawn in class? I never yawn in class. I'm never sleepy in class. Class is fun. I guess I have to start that over. I don't remember how it ended. I don't know where that sentence ended. Don't say that. I can't get these phones to work. I poke at them and they don't do anything. And so many, and her first generation, like, hardware. Designing products that, oh wait, I could have a sip of coffee. In 1932, the son of Charles Lindbergh, who had found fame flying across the Atlantic as the first solo flight. No, you can't say that because then it sounds like the son flew the airplane. The son didn't fly the airplane. The son was kidnapped and then killed. It is so cold. It's May 10th and it's 47 degrees. And I turn the heat off and it's only 52 in here. Am I ever going to finish this? Am I ever going to finish this? It's taking forever. Am I ever going to finish this? Ooh, I said that sentence good. I'm so cold. I need to do some jumping jacks. Sirens everywhere, sirens everywhere. I live a block from a firehouse, so sirens.